Hi, my name is Dakota, and I'm 27. I used to think my family had my back. At least, that's what I told myself. My mom. Well, she was always sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, but I thought she'd never cross the line. Until one night, everything changed. My small house, my first real home, went up in flames. And when I called her, hoping for comfort, she laughed. I never expected cruelty to sound so casual. So, permanent. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories on family drama and emotional courage. I remember the night like it was happening right now. The smell, the heat, the sound of sirens mixing with the crackle of wood. I was sitting on my faded couch, flipping through old photo albums I had just brought down from the attic. My apartment wasn't fancy. A little one-bedroom rental in a quiet American suburb. The kind of place you take pride in because it's yours, even if it's small and a little worn around the edges. That night, it felt like home. Cozy, quiet, mine. And then it wasn't. The first hint something was wrong came as a faint whiff of smoke, barely noticeable at first, drifting in through the cracked kitchen window. I frowned, setting my photo album aside. Probably just someone burning leaves outside. I muttered, but then I noticed the edges of the living room rug curling, the faint orange glow flickering across the ceiling. My stomach dropped. I ran to the kitchen and saw it, a tiny spark jumping from the stove, spreading faster than I could comprehend. Flames licked the walls, curling up toward the ceiling, hungry and relentless. My heart pounded like a jackhammer in my chest. I grabbed the fire extinguisher under the sink, shaking it as I sprayed, but the fire roared back like it was alive. Panic set in, and I realized instantly that there was no stopping this alone. My home, my memories, everything I had built in months was slipping away before my eyes. The fire alarm screamed, a shrill, desperate sound that seemed to match my own panic. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed my mom, hoping, praying for some kind of comfort. She answered after a few rings, cheerful as always. "Hey, sweetie, what's up?" Her voice should have been a lifeline. Instead, it became a dagger. "Mom, there's a fire. I need help." I yelled, trying to keep my voice steady despite the shaking. I could hear the crackle of flames behind me, the way the smoke stung my eyes. "Please, I don't know what to do." Then she laughed, just a sharp, casual laugh that cut through the chaos like ice. "Oh, Dakota," she said, still chuckling, "you always manage to get yourself into something ridiculous. Are you serious?" I froze. My phone slipped slightly in my hand. My mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Mom, it's real. Everything's burning." I shouted, my voice breaking. My own mother, my family was laughing at the destruction of my life. I don't think anyone really knows what it's like to be laughed at while your world collapses around you. It's not just betrayal. It's a kind of disbelief that stabs at the soul. For a second, I didn't even care about the fire. All I could feel was this hollow emptiness where love should have been. By the time I hung up, the fire had grown. The flames reached the ceiling, licking the smoke detector until it emitted a piercing, intermittent alarm. The air was thick and suffocating. I tried to grab a few things, my laptop, a backpack with some clothes, but the smoke made it impossible. Every room I entered was a hazard. The heat seared my hands, the floor felt unstable, and the walls glowed ominously as if mocking my panic. I barely made it outside, coughing, eyes streaming, heart hammering. The fire had already consumed most of the living room and was creeping toward the bedroom. My neighbor, Mrs. Hampton, an older woman who had lived next door for decades, was already on her porch, staring wide-eyed at the inferno. "Oh, my God, Dakota, call 911, she shouted, waving frantically. I did. They're on the way. I coughed back, my voice raw. My hair clung to my damp face from the smoke. I stood there, helpless, as the fire leapt and twisted, devouring the home I had taken pride in. My life's work, all the small joys of living independently for the first time, was melting away in seconds. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, I noticed a small detail that hit me harder than the flames themselves. The tiny photo frames I had displayed on my mantel, birthday pictures, silly snapshots of me with friends, memories of holidays, had begun to warp and crack in the heat. One by one, they fell, glass shattering on the concrete below. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a sob. The fire trucks arrived, lights flashing red and blue across the street. Firefighters jumped out, cords and hoses in hand, shouting instructions. "Stay back. Get to safety," one of them yelled. I obeyed, moving further down the sidewalk, trying to catch my breath. I watched as they fought the fire, spraying water, breaking through walls, but I knew in my heart it was too late. And all the while, I couldn't shake my mother's laugh. It echoed in my head, over and over, like a recording I couldn't erase. I couldn't understand how someone who was supposed to care for me could find amusement in my pain. The feeling of betrayal was heavier than any smoke, more suffocating than the heat I had escaped. Mrs. Hampton, sensing my distress, came over cautiously. "Dakota, honey, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Do you have somewhere to go?" I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. I lost everything." She put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "We'll figure something out. You're not alone, okay? Not tonight." Her warmth was a sharp contrast to the cold, cruel laughter that still clung to me like smoke. As I watched the firefighters continue their work, I couldn't stop thinking about all the things I had left behind. My favorite mug, the little rug I had bought at a thrift store, the stack of books I'd been meaning to read, the clothes that carried memories of first jobs and first dates, they were all gone. It wasn't just stuff. It was pieces of me. Then came the fire inspector. He shook his head as he scribbled notes. "Electrical issue, most likely. Looks like faulty wiring in the kitchen caused it. Luckily, no one was hurt." He didn't know how close I had come to disaster. I nodded silently, barely hearing him. My mind was somewhere else, trapped in the sound of laughter. I sat on the curb for hours, wrapped in a thin blanket provided by a firefighter. Smoke lingered in the air, and the smell of burning wood and plastic clung to my hair and clothes. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. There was nothing left to go back to. My first apartment, the place I thought would be mine for years, it was reduced to ash. Eventually, I called my best friend. "Jenna, I don't know where to go," I admitted, my voice cracking. She immediately offered her couch, her spare bedroom. "You're coming here. Now, don't think about anything else." Her kindness was a lifeline in a night of chaos. On the ride to her apartment, I kept replaying the phone call with my mom. I couldn't stop asking myself, why did she laugh? Did she ever care at all? Was it jealousy, resentment, or just cruelty for the sake of cruelty? I had no answers, only the hollow echo of that laugh, and it followed me like a shadow. By the time I reached Jenna's place, my body was exhausted, my throat sore, my eyes burning. But what I didn't expect was the sinking feeling that came afterward, the realization that my mother didn't just fail me that night. She had betrayed me in the most personal way possible, and I couldn't just shake it off. I spent the night on her couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city outside, trying to make sense of what had happened. The fire had taken everything material, but my mother's laughter had taken something deeper. My trust, my sense of safety, the comfort I had believed family provided. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames climbing higher, heard the glass shatter, and remembered her laugh. I realized in that moment that nothing would ever feel the same. I had survived the fire physically, but emotionally, I was burning too. The next morning, I returned briefly to the scene with Jenna just to look. Firefighters had left, leaving behind only charred wood, melted siding, and the faint, acrid smell of smoke. Neighbors whispered quietly, some offering help, some just watching. I picked through the remnants, retrieving nothing because there was nothing to retrieve. Even memories, it seemed, were reduced to ashes. And yet, amid all that destruction, one thought stood out clearer than ever. I wouldn't call her again. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. The fire had burned my house, but her laughter had burned something far deeper. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew one thing: I would survive. Somehow, I would rebuild. The night my house burned down didn't just end with flames. It ended with realization. My family, or at least the one person I thought loved me the most, could hurt me more than any disaster ever could. And that realization would shape everything I did afterward. The morning after the fire, I sat on Jenna's couch, wrapped in one of her old blankets, feeling the lingering ache in my chest. My arms were sore from coughing, my lungs heavy with smoke that refused to leave. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that being alive was enough. But deep down, I knew survival alone wasn't the solution. I had to rebuild my life from nothing. Jenna stirred coffee in her kitchen, humming softly. She had always been practical, steady in a way that made people feel safe. "You need to eat something, Dakota," she said, placing a mug in front of me. The warmth of it steamed between my hands, yet even that comfort felt distant, fragile. I nodded, taking a small sip. The first challenge hit immediately, finding a place to stay beyond Jenna's couch. Her spare room was only temporary, and I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I made a list of nearby motels, affordable rooms, and even shelters. Each option felt inadequate, a reminder that my independence had vanished overnight. The reality was harsh. I had no insurance to replace what was lost, no safety net, no family to call on. I spent the morning gathering what little I had salvaged, mostly a duffel bag of clothes I had packed hastily before the flames consumed the rest. Each shirt, each worn-out pair of jeans, carried a memory I now clutched like treasure. Even in such a small collection, I felt the weight of loss heavier than any physical burden. By mid-afternoon, I had secured a tiny motel room a few miles from Jenna's place. The smell of stale carpet and cleaning chemicals hit me the second I opened the door. It was far from home, far from comfort, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. I dragged my duffel inside, unpacking slowly, methodically, as if the routine could anchor me against the emotional chaos swirling in my mind. Money was the next obstacle. I had been working a decent job before the fire, but that income was tied to the life I had just lost. My laptop, documents, even my work clothes, all gone. I had no paycheck, no identification for direct deposit, and very little cash on hand. Desperation gnawed at me, but I refused to panic. I knew I had to take one step at a time, even if each step felt like walking on broken glass. I spent that evening cold calling temp agencies, checking online listings for odd jobs, and walking from store to store, handing out resumes. Each interaction was a reminder of vulnerability. People treated me politely, but I could sense the subtle skepticism. A young woman displaced, trying to rebuild from scratch. Still, I refused to falter. "I'll figure it out," I whispered to myself repeatedly. The first job came quicker than I expected, a part-time night shift at a small 24-hour diner. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what I dreamed of, but it paid rent and put food on my plate. My first night, I arrived before the sun had set, the fluorescent lights of the diner harsh and unforgiving. The smell of coffee, frying eggs, and cleaning chemicals mingled, almost nauseating at first. I pulled on the uniform they handed me, a faded apron that smelled faintly of smoke and detergent, and stepped behind the counter. The work was exhausting. Fryers hissed, coffee machines sputtered, and the regular customers were impatient in ways that felt petty compared to the chaos of the fire. I moved quickly, cleaning tables, refilling coffee, taking orders, but my mind wandered constantly. Every sizzle of the pan, every clatter of a plate reminded me that my life had been reduced to survival mode. I felt invisible, yet hyper-aware of every misstep. Some nights, I sat in the empty diner after closing, my feet sore, my hands raw from scrubbing, and allowed myself a moment to cry. I cried for the life I had lost, for the small joys that no longer existed, the tiny apartment, the pictures on the mantel, the way I had once imagined quiet evenings spent cooking or reading without fear. And then I reminded myself why I was here, because giving up wasn't an option. The next challenge was emotional. Loneliness hit me like a wave, more relentless than any physical hardship. I hadn't just lost my home, I had lost the sense of security that came with family support. My mom's laugh from the night of the fire was burned into my memory, a cruel soundtrack to my attempts at rebuilding. Some nights, I found myself dialing her number on autopilot, only to hang up before she could answer. I didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want to be reminded of betrayal, but part of me ached for validation, for someone to say, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Instead, I found solace in small connections. There was Mr. Harris, the elderly man who ran the diner, who sometimes slipped me extra slices of pie when he noticed my quiet exhaustion. There was a young woman named Maria, another temp worker who would check in on me at the motel, offering snacks, advice, or a kind smile. Their presence didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me that not all people were cruel, that kindness existed even in the shadows of disaster. One afternoon, while walking to pick up laundry at a nearby laundromat, I ran into a neighbor from my old apartment complex, a middle-aged woman named Sharon. She had witnessed the fire and offered a tentative smile. "Dakota, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how hard this is." I nodded politely, swallowing the lump in my throat. She didn't know the full story, not about my mom, not about the betrayal. And in that moment, I didn't tell her. Some truths I realized were mine alone to carry. Finances remained a constant source of stress. I balanced shifts at the diner with gig work, delivering groceries, babysitting, and even cleaning houses for extra cash. Each paycheck went immediately to the motel, to groceries, to replacing essentials. Luxury or comfort was a word I had forgotten. I lived in a routine of sheer necessity, every dollar stretched, every minute accounted for. Yet within this struggle, I discovered a strange sense of pride. I was rebuilding my life entirely on my own, without a handout from anyone who had failed me. The motel itself became both sanctuary and prison. The walls were thin. I could hear neighbors arguing, the occasional crying baby, the clatter of carts in the hallway. I grew hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every moment of privacy stolen. Yet I decorated the small space with remnants from my duffel bag, photos printed before the fire, a favorite mug, a blanket that smelled faintly of home. They weren't much, but they reminded me that I still had a life worth living. Sleep was often impossible. My mind would replay the fire endlessly. The heat, the smoke, the way the fire had seemed to consume everything without mercy. I would relive my mother's laugh, the cruel casualness that had cut deeper than any flame. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the motel room spinning, my hands shaking as if the fire were still there. I learned to cope by writing everything down in a small notebook, a kind of ledger of loss and survival. Each word felt like a step forward, a way to reclaim control over a life that had been stolen overnight. One morning, I decided to tackle the practicalities, replacing identification, bank cards, and personal documents destroyed in the fire. Standing in the crowded DMV, holding a temporary ID, I felt small and exposed. People shuffled past me, impatient, indifferent. I waited hours, listening to the endless hum of fluorescent lights, the scratching of pens on forms. But when I finally walked out with new documents in hand, a sense of quiet victory washed over me. Small steps, yes, but steps nonetheless. Even as I rebuilt the practical side of my life, the emotional side remained fragile. I found myself avoiding mirrors some days, unwilling to face the reflection of someone who had been hurt so deeply. On others, I stared long enough to remind myself that the Dakota looking back was still me, scarred, yes, but capable, strong, and unbroken. That reflection became my mantra. I may have lost a home, but I would not lose myself. Then came the first small victory. After weeks of juggling temp work, odd jobs, and night shifts, I secured a slightly better paying position at a small local office. It wasn't glamorous, but it offered stability and the chance to save. I walked into the office on my first day, heart pounding, palms sweaty, yet filled with a strange pride. I had navigated the chaos, endured betrayal, and here I was, standing tall despite everything. Even in that moment of progress, the fire and the laughter lingered. Occasionally, a memory would surface, the smell of smoke on my hair, the crackling flames, my mother's laugh, and I would feel a flicker of the old hurt. But I refused to let it define me. Instead, I channeled it, using it as fuel to keep moving forward, to keep picking up the pieces that life had scattered. One evening, I returned to the small motel after a long shift and found a note slipped under my door. It was from Maria, the temp worker who had become a friend. "I know it's hard, but you're stronger than you think. Keep going, Dakota." I held that note in my hands, tears welling up, and for the first time in weeks, allowed myself a moment of hope. Even in the midst of devastation, there were people who believed in me. By the end of the month, I had a modest routine: work, rest, minimal social interaction, and small steps toward stability. I was living paycheck to paycheck, yes, but I was surviving. And more than surviving, I was learning to thrive in ways I hadn't expected. The fire had taken my home, my possessions, and my sense of security, but it hadn't taken me. That realization became the quiet backbone of my new life. It was in these weeks that I truly understood the meaning of resilience. Life after the fire wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic comebacks. It was about showing up each day, making choices, and refusing to be defined by the cruelty of others. Each small act, washing clothes in the laundromat, serving coffee at the diner, filing paperwork in the office, was a statement. I was still here. I was still me. The solitude, once suffocating, began to feel empowering. I could make decisions without interference, manage my schedule without judgment, and build a foundation that was entirely my own. The motel room, once a reminder of displacement, became a place of quiet reflection. I decorated it with small mementos: a photo of my dog, a pressed leaf from my old backyard, a tiny jar of coins saved from odd jobs, and each item represented a victory. Through it all, the memory of my mother's laughter never disappeared. It became a shadow that reminded me of what I refused to allow in my life: cruelty disguised as humor, the betrayal of trust, the thoughtless dismissal of another person's pain. I couldn't change her, and I couldn't control her reaction. But I could control myself. I could survive, rebuild, and claim my own dignity. By the time I settled into a modest rhythm, life seemed to move with an indifferent pace, oblivious to all the chaos I had endured. The fire had taken my home, my belongings, and my sense of safety, but it had also left me with something unexpected, a stubborn spark of determination. Each day I woke in my tiny motel room. It felt like a challenge to face the world again, and yet, somehow, I did. The office job I had secured became my anchor. The morning light spilling across the small desk reminded me that I could still build something tangible, something mine, even if it was small and imperfect. My coworkers were unaware of the full scope of what I'd lost. To them, I was simply the quiet woman typing, answering calls, organizing files. I never revealed the fire or the betrayal behind it. Not yet. I wanted to prove to myself, first, that I could stand on my own before anyone else knew my pain. I developed a habit of taking the long walk home, about 3 blocks from the office to the motel, as a way to think without distractions. Some days, the autumn wind was crisp and sharp, making me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. I noticed how the air smelled differently in my neighborhood now, burnt leaves mingling with the distant scent of coffee shops and city traffic. There was life everywhere, vibrant and relentless, even as I struggled to make sense of my own. One afternoon, as I passed a small park on my walk, I noticed a group of children playing tag near a worn swing set. Their laughter was carefree, pure, a sharp contrast to the heaviness I carried. I paused for a moment, watching, and felt a pang of longing for simpler days, when my own life had seemed secure. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to remember what it felt like to not be consumed by fear or betrayal. Then I shook my head, reminding myself that nostalgia was a luxury I couldn't afford. Workdays began to blend, yet I could feel subtle changes in myself. I had become sharper, more cautious, and quietly resilient. Handling clients over the phone or dealing with demanding supervisors, I noticed that I no longer flinched at confrontation. My confidence, small but noticeable, grew from the embers of my past struggles. Even when I made mistakes, I learned to correct them swiftly without letting frustration consume me. Each minor victory, each task completed, felt like reclaiming a piece of control that had been stripped away that fateful night. Still, the fire wasn't gone from my mind. Some nights, lying in bed, I'd relive the scene. The flickering orange glow, the sirens wailing, the weight of my mother's laugh echoing over it all. It wasn't just a memory. It had become a shadow that lingered in the corners of my consciousness. At first, these thoughts paralyzed me, but slowly I began to turn them into fuel. Every memory of her laughter, every pang of betrayal became a quiet motivation to prove that I could thrive without her, without anyone who had once undermined me. It was during one of these long walks home that I stumbled upon a small, neglected community garden tucked behind a row of old townhouses. The garden was half overgrown, weeds choking the few vegetables that had survived, but it had potential. On a whim, I decided to volunteer. Tending to the soil, planting seeds, and coaxing life from the earth became therapeutic. It was a tangible way to nurture something, to create life amid the destruction I had experienced. The garden taught me patience, and it reminded me that growth takes time, sometimes longer than we expect, but it always starts somewhere. One day, while planting marigolds near a sun-warmed patch of dirt, an elderly man named Walter approached. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "You've got a steady hand," he said. "Been gardening long?" "Not really," I admitted, wiping dirt from my fingers. "I'm just trying to keep busy." He nodded knowingly. Sometimes that's all we can do. Life doesn't always wait for us to heal, so we learn to move anyway. His words struck a chord. I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the fire or the laughter. It meant living despite them. Walter and I worked together in the garden several times a week, swapping stories about life, loss, and resilience. It was quiet companionship, no judgment, just shared effort. It reminded me that even small connections could help mend parts of yourself that felt irreparably broken. At work, I faced challenges I hadn't anticipated. One of my supervisors, a man named Paul, had a habit of belittling employees for minor errors. At first, I froze under his criticism, but gradually, I learned to respond calmly, assertively, without fear. One afternoon, after he snapped at me for misfiling a document, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I understand. I'll correct it immediately." Then I did. No excuses, no panic, just action. That moment was small but powerful. It reminded me that surviving the fire had taught me a resilience that couldn't be shaken by office politics or petty criticism. Even as I gained stability, financial strain remained a constant shadow. Rent, bills, groceries, and the cost of replacing basic necessities left little room for comfort. Some nights, I sat on the motel bed with an open calculator and a stack of receipts, budgeting with a meticulousness I hadn't needed before. Each penny accounted for. Each dollar stretched became a quiet assertion of control over a life that had once been thrown into chaos. Social interactions remained complicated. I had lost contact with many old friends during the upheaval, and new friendships were tentative. Maria, my coworker, remained a bright spot. We often shared late-night coffee breaks, comparing shifts and venting frustrations. She never pressed me for personal details, sensing the walls I had built. I appreciated that. Trust had become fragile, something to be earned slowly, cautiously. One evening, as I walked back from work under a fading orange sky, I noticed a familiar figure across the street. It was Sharon, the neighbor from my old apartment complex. She waved, and I hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge her. But she approached, a hesitant smile on her face. "Hey, Dakota, how have you been holding up?" she asked. I exhaled, forcing a small smile. "Better, I think. Slowly, but better." Her eyes softened. "Good. I wasn't sure you'd come back around this area. I try not to dwell on the past," I said. Truthfully, it was complicated. I thought about the fire, about my mother's laugh, about the hollow ache that had followed me everywhere. I didn't dwell, but I didn't forget either. Sharon offered a piece of advice I hadn't considered. Sometimes it helps to see the pieces of your life you can control and let go of what you can't. It sounded simple, but I realized it wasn't. Letting go of my mother's betrayal, the fire, the things I had lost, it wasn't easy. Every day, I battled flashes of anger, grief, and fear. But her words reminded me that moving forward wasn't about erasing the past. It was about managing it, channeling it into something productive, something that fueled growth rather than despair. Weeks turned into months. My routine became steadier. I woke early, walked to the office, tended to the garden when time allowed, and returned to my motel to rest. Nights were quieter, filled with journaling, reading, or listening to music that soothed my nerves. I began to feel a sense of ownership over my life, small victories stacking into a foundation I could rely on. One day, while organizing files at work, I received a call from a collection agency regarding a bill from my old apartment. My stomach twisted, a mixture of fear and exhaustion washing over me. I took a deep breath and handled the call calmly, negotiating payments and explaining the circumstances. It was stressful, yes, but unlike before, I didn't feel helpless. I could face these challenges head-on without panic, without relying on anyone else to rescue me. Even my relationship with my own reflection had changed. I no longer recoiled at the tired eyes, the stress lines, or the way my hair clung to my face after long shifts. Instead, I saw someone who had endured devastation, betrayal, and loss, and still stood. I had rebuilt routines, regained a sense of agency, and learned that strength was quieter than people expected. Yet the fire within me, the anger, the sense of injustice, the betrayal, never fully faded. It was a companion now, a quiet reminder of where I had been, and why I needed to continue moving forward. I didn't dwell on it obsessively, but I allowed it to fuel my decisions. I worked harder, stayed disciplined, and refused to let anyone, even my own family, dictate my worth or my happiness. It was in the quiet moments, tending to marigolds, walking home under a soft twilight, organizing papers at my desk, that I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a fragile but growing sense of hope. Life moved on around me, relentless and often indifferent, yet I discovered that I could move on too while carrying the fire within me. It wasn't destructive anymore. It was illumination, guiding me forward, reminding me that resilience could coexist with grief, that growth could coexist with anger. Even as I carved a new life for myself, building routines, earning a steady income, and slowly reclaiming the stability the fire had taken, I couldn't shake a quiet awareness. Something was shifting in my family's world. At first, I didn't seek it out. I didn't want to know. But little hints started arriving unexpectedly, snippets of conversation overheard, subtle references in passing, even social media posts I never bothered to engage with. It began with a brief text from my sister, Emily. I hadn't spoken to her since the fire, and I wasn't looking to reopen old wounds. But the message read, "Mom's having trouble with the bills. Thought you should know." There was no apology, no concern for me, no recognition of the chaos my mother's laughter had caused that night. Just a matter-of-fact statement. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. For a long moment, I didn't respond. My first impulse was to feel nothing, to let it slide. But a small, quiet part of me, the part that remembered all those months of being mocked and dismissed, stirred with a strange mix of anticipation and curiosity. Over the next few weeks, small cracks became more visible. A distant cousin, unaware of the details of my family's dynamics, mentioned in passing that my mother had been struggling to manage the bills, often forgetting due dates, leaving calls unanswered. My siblings seemed frazzled, overworked, snapping at one another over trivial disagreements. I didn't need confirmation. These were the consequences of their own dependence, a dependence they had once assumed would always be fulfilled without gratitude. I didn't rush to contact them. Instead, I observed quietly, allowing myself to see the natural unraveling of their lives. There was no pleasure in it, only clarity. My absence had consequences, and yet these consequences didn't stem from malice or vengeance. They stemmed from the simple fact that I was no longer there to pick up the pieces they had taken for granted. One morning, while walking past the old neighborhood where my family still lived, I noticed the mailbox at my mother's house overflowing with notices and bills. The front yard, once meticulously maintained, had patches of dead grass and weeds creeping over the walkway. The mailbox door was dented, hanging awkwardly on its hinge. I stopped, heart tight, breathing in the familiar scent of suburban air mixed with decay. It was surreal, seeing the decline unfold quietly, invisibly. I began hearing more details from acquaintances and neighbors, carefully pieced together like a puzzle. My brother, Aaron, had taken a part-time job at a convenience store to cover expenses they had neglected. My mother had spent nights worrying over bills and missed appointments, often muttering to herself in frustration. My sister, Emily, was visibly exhausted, juggling her own work with household responsibilities that had been mine to manage before the fire. These weren't dramatic catastrophes, not yet, but to them, it was chaos, their world functioning only at the edge of collapse. I remember one afternoon standing in the window of a coffee shop, watching my mother shuffle across the street, carrying a bag of groceries she clearly hadn't budgeted for. She looked frazzled, anxious, her posture rigid, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. The mother who had laughed at me seemed almost unrecognizable, hardened by her own struggles, stripped of the casual confidence she once carried. I didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call. I wanted her to feel the absence I had endured, quietly, invisibly. The silence itself became its own form of tension. No one called me for help. No one apologized for the mockery. No one acknowledged the fire or my months of hardship. And yet, the consequences of my absence grew louder than words ever could. I found it almost poetic, quiet, inevitable, and deeply satisfying. The very people who had assumed my presence as a guarantee were now grappling with the gap I left behind. Still, it wasn't all visible from a distance. I relied on snippets of information, a neighbor's sympathetic glance, a mention during a rare family interaction, or social media posts that hinted at frustration and panic. It was a slow revelation, a realization that the structures they had relied on, my organizational skills, my emotional labor, my constant support, were gone, leaving them to fend for themselves. One particularly vivid incident occurred when a friend casually mentioned seeing my mother at the supermarket, struggling with an overflowing cart. She looked tense, my friend said. She kept checking the lines, muttering about how she couldn't manage the bills. I absorbed the words silently, sipping my coffee, feeling a sense of quiet validation. This wasn't revenge. It was reality unfolding naturally, the consequences of neglect and underestimating someone who had once been indispensable. I began to understand the true weight of absence. It wasn't dramatic like a fire or a storm. It was quiet, persistent. It seeped into routines, relationships, and daily responsibilities, eroding confidence and exposing weaknesses. And it mirrored the way my mother's laughter had haunted me, small, unrelenting, cutting deeper because it was personal, and it came from someone who should have cared. There were subtle, almost unnoticeable hints of regret creeping into their lives. My mother occasionally mentioned me in conversations with relatives, a wistful tone threading through her voice. "I wish Dakota could help with this," she said once, overheard by a cousin. But the words were fleeting, quickly swallowed by frustration and daily struggles. My siblings began to argue more openly, each blaming the other for oversights that had once been my responsibility. It wasn't vindictive, it was practical stress, but to me, it felt like justice delivered quietly, invisibly. I didn't intervene. I refused. Part of me wanted to be there, to offer a hand, but another, stronger part relished the independence I had earned. They had underestimated my presence, taken it for granted, and now they were learning to function without me. Their discomfort was natural, inevitable, and necessary. And still, beneath it all, I maintained a sense of empathy. I wasn't cruel. I simply recognized the truth. Absence often speaks louder than confrontation, and silence carries its own weight. One evening, I walked past my mother's house again, noticing the dim light of the kitchen flickering through the blinds. I imagined her sitting at the table, hands trembling slightly as she sorted bills, the faint lines of worry etched across her face. I paused, breathing in the night air, acknowledging a mix of emotions, satisfaction, sadness, and a subtle, unspoken hope that they would learn from this. I didn't need to witness it directly. The signs were everywhere. The days grew longer, and with each passing week, the silence became a steady hum in my life. It was a reminder of what I had endured, a reflection of their dependency, and a measure of my own strength. I watched as the family grappled with challenges that I had once handled seamlessly, seeing firsthand how essential my presence had been, not in some dramatic way, but in the quiet, persistent management of everyday life. Small incidents kept reinforcing this lesson. I heard that my mother had forgotten a doctor's appointment, forcing her to reschedule at the last minute. My brother, Aaron, left the stove on while cooking dinner, triggering a small kitchen scare that fortunately caused no real damage. Emily, overextended, missed filing important paperwork for her job, drawing a warning from her supervisor. None of these were catastrophic, but to them, they felt like failures magnified by the absence of someone reliable. And yet, there was a subtle irony in all of this. The mother who had mocked my misfortune now faced her own struggles quietly, without anyone to cushion the impact. My siblings, once impatient with minor tasks, now experienced the weight of responsibility firsthand. The family had been forced to confront the realities they had ignored, and though they hadn't asked for guidance, they were learning nonetheless. I realized that the fire had taught me more than survival. It had taught me perspective. It had shown me the value of presence, the fragility of dependence, and the way absence can illuminate truths people would otherwise ignore. Watching their struggles unfold, I felt no gloating satisfaction, only a sense of inevitability. The world moves on, people adapt, and consequences follow naturally when someone once indispensable is no longer available. One late night, I received an unexpected call from a distant cousin. "Hey, Dakota, I don't mean to intrude, but Mom's been asking about you." The cousin said carefully, "She's struggling. Thought you should know." I didn't respond immediately. I listened quietly, heart tightening. I knew what she meant. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't need to speak. This was their reckoning, subtle and silent, unfolding without dramatic confrontation. And that was exactly how it should be. For the first time, I truly understood the power of absence. It wasn't about revenge or malice. It was about presence and its inverse. My absence was teaching lessons they had refused to learn while I was nearby, lessons about responsibility, empathy, and awareness. The silence that haunted them was not mine to deliver, but it was mine to observe, acknowledge, and let exist naturally. Even as I returned to my life, work, the garden, nightly walks, small victories, the awareness of their struggles remained a quiet companion. I could feel it lingering in the edges of my consciousness, a reminder of balance restored, of lessons quietly internalized. The silence was not cruel. It was instructive, necessary, and strangely satisfying. I didn't intervene. I refused. Part of me wanted to be there, to offer a hand, but another, stronger part relished the independence I had earned. They had underestimated my presence, taken it for granted, and now they were learning to function without me. Their discomfort was natural, inevitable, and necessary. And still, beneath it all, I maintained a sense of empathy. I wasn't cruel. I simply recognized the truth. Absence often speaks louder than confrontation, and silence carries its own weight. One evening, I walked past my mother's house again, noticing the dim light of the kitchen flickering through the blinds. I imagined her sitting at the table, hands trembling slightly as she sorted bills, the faint lines of worry etched across her face. I paused, breathing in the night air, acknowledging a mix of emotions, satisfaction, sadness, and a subtle, unspoken hope that they would learn from this. I didn't need to witness it directly. The signs were everywhere. The days grew longer, and with each passing week, the silence became a steady hum in my life. It was a reminder of what I had endured, a reflection of their dependency, and a measure of my own strength. I watched as the family grappled with challenges that I had once handled seamlessly, seeing firsthand how essential my presence had been, not in some dramatic way, but in the quiet, persistent management of everyday life. Small incidents kept reinforcing this lesson. I heard that my mother had forgotten a doctor's appointment, forcing her to reschedule at the last minute. My brother, Aaron, left the stove on while cooking dinner, triggering a small kitchen scare that fortunately caused no real damage. Emily, overextended, missed filing important paperwork for her job, drawing a warning from her supervisor. None of these were catastrophic, but to them, they felt like failures magnified by the absence of someone reliable. And yet, there was a subtle irony in all of this. The mother who had mocked my misfortune now faced her own struggles quietly, without anyone to cushion the impact. My siblings, once impatient with minor tasks, now experienced the weight of responsibility firsthand. The family had been forced to confront the realities they had ignored, and though they hadn't asked for guidance, they were learning nonetheless. I realized that the fire had taught me more than survival. It had taught me perspective. It had shown me the value of presence, the fragility of dependence, and the way absence can illuminate truths people would otherwise ignore. Watching their struggles unfold, I felt no gloating satisfaction, only a sense of inevitability. The world moves on, people adapt, and consequences follow naturally when someone once indispensable is no longer available. One late night, I received an unexpected call from a distant cousin. "Hey, Dakota, I don't mean to intrude, but Mom's been asking about you." The cousin said carefully, "She's struggling. Thought you should know." I didn't respond immediately. I listened quietly, heart tightening. I knew what she meant. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't need to speak. This was their reckoning, subtle and silent, unfolding without dramatic confrontation. And that was exactly how it should be. For the first time, I truly understood the power of absence. It wasn't about revenge or malice. It was about presence and its inverse. My absence was teaching lessons they had refused to learn while I was nearby, lessons about responsibility, empathy, and awareness. The silence that haunted them was not mine to deliver, but it was mine to observe, acknowledge, and let exist naturally. Even as I returned to my life, work, the garden, nightly walks, small victories, the awareness of their struggles remained a quiet companion. I could feel it lingering in the edges of my consciousness, a reminder of balance restored, of lessons quietly internalized. The silence was not cruel. It was instructive, necessary, and strangely satisfying. It was late afternoon when I first felt the unmistakable weight of their absence in a way I could no longer ignore, not for me, but for them. I had been walking along the familiar street near my old neighborhood, the sun sinking low behind the houses, long shadows stretching across cracked sidewalks. Everything looked ordinary. Yet beneath the calm, I could sense the tremors of struggle in the lives I had once held together with silent labor and endless patience. I watched as my mother emerged from her front door, dragging a vacuum cleaner across the porch, its cord tangled and frayed. The hose rattled, scraping against the weathered wood steps. She glanced at the mail piled in the mailbox, then cursed under her breath as it toppled over, letters spilling onto the grass. The small chaos, a tipped mailbox, a frayed vacuum, scattered envelopes, was amplified by her visible stress. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if every task had become a burden that required careful negotiation with exhaustion itself. The absence I had once dreaded to witness had transformed into a strange, almost poetic clarity. They were surviving, but the survival looked messy, unpolished, and exhausting. The mother who had laughed at my misfortune now seemed fragile in the harsh light of reality, a reflection of vulnerability she had never shown me. And still I did not approach. I merely observed. Sometimes the fire of the past needs no gasoline to spread. It just quietly illuminates truths no one is ready to face. It started with small crises, each one a reflection of their dependency and the gaps I had left behind. My brother, Aaron, was forced to handle the grocery budget alone. I heard from a neighbor that he had returned home one evening, arms laden with bags. only to realize he had forgotten essential items. Frustrated, he had dropped the bags in the driveway and stormed inside, slamming doors behind him. That evening, my sister Emily was called into her boss's office after misfiling paperwork they had entrusted to me in my absence. Her apology had been stilted, full of nervous laughter and excuses that did little to mask the reality. The family had relied too heavily on me, and now the cracks were widening. One afternoon, while tending to my garden, a small sanctuary I had nurtured over months, I received a text from a distant cousin. "Mom's fridge broke again. She can't figure out the repair." I stared at the message, heart tightening. Part of me wanted to respond, to intervene, but another part, a stronger, fiercer part, held back. They had to learn to navigate life without me. They had laughed at my fire, mocked my loss, and now they were grappling with consequences I had silently predicted. I began noticing patterns in their struggles, patterns that echoed the chaos I had endured when I was the one holding everything together. My mother left lights on all day, forgetting to pay attention to electricity bills. Aaron neglected simple repairs, like tightening a leaky faucet or changing a light bulb, leading to small but accumulating damage. Emily double-booked appointments, overlooked deadlines, and argued constantly with her siblings over tasks they had once taken for granted. Their world, once carefully managed by my presence, now wavered like a house of cards in a mild wind. It wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. No fire, no sirens, no sudden collapse, but it was relentless. Quiet crises piled atop one another, creating a pressure cooker of stress and exhaustion. One night, I watched from across the street as my mother stood in her kitchen, hands trembling, trying to juggle a pot of boiling water while reading a bill. I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders hunched under invisible weight. And in that moment, I realized that my absence wasn't just a void, it was a force that reshaped their reality. I found myself walking these streets, often not out of malice, but out of fascination. How had they managed when I was gone? How would they continue? I watched small incidents unfold. My brother burning dinner for the third time that week, Emily spilling coffee on important documents, my mother struggling to carry groceries up the steps without help. Each moment reinforced what I already knew. Absence teaches lessons more effectively than confrontation ever could. The most vivid moment came one rainy evening. I had ducked under a neighbor's porch to avoid the downpour and noticed my mother struggling with a leaking roof. Water dripped into the corner of her living room, soaking a carpet she couldn't afford to replace. She tried to contain it with towels, moving buckets under the worst drips, her face pale with frustration and fatigue. I could almost hear her thoughts, worrying, calculating, panicking, all the while realizing there was no one to help. I stayed there, hidden in the shadows, watching, my heart twisted, not from satisfaction, but from the sharp truth of inevitability. This was the world she had created for herself, one she had underestimated me enough to assume would never fall apart. And now it was unraveling quietly, without fanfare, without anyone to catch the pieces before they fell. As the weeks passed, I observed more. Phone calls went unanswered, bills piled up, and the family's once smooth routine became chaotic and disjointed. Friends whispered about their exhaustion. Neighbors noticed a growing tension, and small inconveniences magnified into daily frustrations. The silence from me, the one I had maintained deliberately, amplified the impact. They were forced to confront the consequences of neglect, responsibility, and overconfidence in a presence they had assumed would always be there. At work, I sometimes found myself distracted, thinking of their struggles from afar. I didn't feel glee or malice, only an awareness of balance restored. The fire they had mocked, the one that destroyed my home and forced me to survive alone, had transformed. It wasn't destructive anymore. It was illuminating. It revealed the gaps in their world, the dependence they had taken for granted, and the strength I had cultivated in its absence. A particular incident drove the lesson home. Emily called the neighbor for help after a minor plumbing disaster flooded her kitchen. She had panicked, unsure what to do, fumbling with wrenches and pipes. When the plumber arrived, she admitted sheepishly that she had never dealt with a leak of this magnitude alone, that she had relied on me too much when I was around. I heard about it secondhand, but I didn't intervene. This, I realized, was their reckoning, their world burning without the one who had once held it together. Even my mother's attitude began to shift subtly. I noticed it in conversations relayed through others, frustration turning to reflection, impatience softening into cautious consideration, the occasional regret slipping into her voice. But it was slow, painful, and entirely self-driven. There were no apologies, no confessions, no dramatic reconciliations. Just the quiet acknowledgement that life was harder without the support I had once provided. I continued my own life, tending to the garden, going to work, and managing my modest motel routine. Yet the awareness of their struggle became a quiet rhythm in my consciousness. It reminded me of the strength I had built, the independence I had earned, and the value of presence. I understood now that their chaos was not punishment I administered, but the natural consequence of their assumptions. And I could observe it without resentment because I had survived, learned, and thrived. The small moments were the most telling. I heard through a neighbor that my mother had forgotten to pick up Aaron from work, leaving him stranded for over an hour. Emily had missed a critical appointment, forcing her boss to intervene. Bills went unpaid longer than expected, causing late fees and minor service interruptions. Each incident was a minor disaster in isolation, but cumulatively, they painted a vivid picture of a family struggling to function without the presence they had taken for granted. One evening, I passed the house again, noticing the lights flicker unevenly. A fuse had blown, likely from overloading circuits they didn't know how to manage. I didn't knock, didn't call, didn't offer help. I simply watched, heart tight, silently acknowledging the natural consequences of absence. Their world burned, not in flames, but in fatigue, frustration, and mismanagement, and it was theirs to endure, unfiltered and raw. Even the smallest interactions carried weight. A text from Emily. "We're barely keeping up. Everything's falling apart." I read it, smiled faintly, and didn't reply. There was no satisfaction in cruelty, only validation in reality. Their struggles were a mirror, reflecting the care and effort I had once poured into their lives, now absent, and the fragility they had assumed I would always compensate for. I realized that witnessing their struggles from a distance gave me something I had never had before: perspective. I could see how my own resilience had grown, how I had learned to navigate life alone, and how my absence could influence without direct confrontation. The world had moved on, but the fire within me remained steady and controlled, illuminating rather than consuming. By the time the first year anniversary of the fire arrived, I had established routines, gained financial stability, and nurtured connections with friends who respected and supported me. The family continued to grapple with the absence of my presence, learning lessons the hard way, and I watched quietly, knowing that the laughter that once mocked me had been replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. It wasn't revenge, it was reality. Their world burned without me, and in that fire, I found a strange, quiet satisfaction. Not from cruelty, but from understanding. Life is relentless, and it doesn't bend to neglect or entitlement. Absence has its consequences, and sometimes those consequences are the most effective teacher of all. Walking home that night, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, I felt a sense of completion. I had endured, I had survived, and I had thrived. They had endured, too, though in a very different way. And the fire that once consumed me had transformed into a quiet strength, a reminder that presence is powerful, absence is instructive, and life moves forward for those willing to rise from the ashes. The first anniversary of the fire arrived, quietly, almost unremarkably, yet it carried a weight I could feel in every step I took that morning. I sat on the edge of my modest motel bed, the sunlight spilling across the sheets, and I let myself breathe. For the first time in months, maybe even a year, I felt truly untethered, not lost, not anxious, not consumed by the memory of that night, but free. The fire had taken everything that could be burned, yet it had left me with something far more enduring: clarity, strength, and the understanding that I was enough on my own. I had been forged in the ashes, tempered by grief, and strengthened by every small victory I had earned. I thought of my family, the same people who had laughed when my home turned to smoke, the same voices that had mocked the devastation I had endured. I didn't feel anger toward them anymore, not in the sharp, consuming way I once had. What lingered was a quiet recognition: absence had consequences. The struggles they faced in my absence were not punishment, they were reality. They were forced to confront the gaps they had relied on me to fill, the responsibilities they had taken for granted, and the fragility that comes from assuming someone else will always be there to hold the pieces together. Their world had burned, not in flames, but in the subtle chaos of missed deadlines, forgotten tasks, and the exhaustion that comes from suddenly having to stand alone. And through it all, I realized something powerful. I had survived without them. I had rebuilt myself from the ruins piece by piece, and nothing they could do would undo that resilience. There was no triumphant confrontation, no shouting or recrimination. Instead, there was a quiet balance, a tension that spoke louder than words ever could. I could observe, and in observing, I understood the lessons that life had carved into both our worlds. The fire had shaped me, yes, but it had also revealed the truth about reliance, about presence, and about strength. I had learned to trust myself, to honor my own boundaries, and to carry my fire as a source of illumination, not destruction. And for them, the silence of my absence had become a teacher, a mirror reflecting the reality they had once overlooked. As I walked through my day, tending to small tasks, nurturing the garden I had cultivated with my own hands, and returning to work with a newfound steadiness, I felt a calm sense of ownership over my life. I had discovered that growth is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and measured, built through persistence, reflection, and the courage to rise after devastation. I had learned that the fire within me would always burn, but it no longer consumed me. It guided me, shaped me, and reminded me of what I had endured and overcome. And in that quiet reflection, I finally felt the last remnants of fear and grief ease. I knew I could face the world, whatever it threw at me, without relying on anyone who had doubted or dismissed me. My family's struggles would continue to unfold, a natural consequence of absence and the choices they had made, but they no longer held power over my life. I had built a life from the ashes, a life of independence, resilience, and quiet satisfaction. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled, knowing that the fire had transformed, not into destruction, but into a strength that could never be taken away. I had survived. I had endured. And my world, my real, living, breathing world, was mine to hold,